spend money to put your life in danger, or go to places where few would venture to. As a female photographer traveling alone, I have often put myself at risk. I have been taken away by the police for questioning for about 20 times, and I have been harassed and molested. I was nearly kidnapped, and I've been awakened by the sounds of gunshots in the middle of the night. And did anyone send me to these places? Absolutely not. And was I paid to be there? No. I am self-funded. And after all my narrow escapes, is there any guarantee that my photos will be published? No. The market is fiercely competitive, with millions of photos floating out there, clamoring for attention. And yet, I am still resolved that photojournalism is the one thing that I will do for life, at all costs. People often ask me, why am I doing all these? And I will always reply, I'm crazy. But does it suffice? Surely there is a method in my madness. And so I did some soul searching, and let's just start from the very beginning. I was in Paris in the summer of 2002, where I managed to catch the traveling exhibition of the World Press Photo. This was a photo that first got me interested in photojournalism. Taken by Eric Rafner, a Danish photographer, in an Afghan refugee camp in Pakistan, of a young boy who died of dehydration. His body was prepared for burial at the Jalojai refugee camp. I was struck by the simplicity of this image. There was no blood or violence, but the three pairs of weather-beaten hands and the serene look on the boy's face, as if it was a relief for him from his miserable existence, told me so much about the decades of suffering that the Afghans had gone through. It was outraging for me to witness how the innocent young ones had to pay the price for conflicts which they did not create. This image had so much emotional impact on me that I started researching and learning more about photojournalism. Prior to this, I had absolutely no knowledge or interest in photography. But it was only 3 years later, after the tsunami in January 2005, that I plunged straight into photojournalism. At that point, I was backpacking around Asia, but with a disaster of such great magnitude, affecting so many people, so close to home, I just could not travel in peace any longer. It was not an easy path for me to try to get access to the disaster zones. I was rejected by various NGOs because I was not an established photojournalist, and I had no portfolio to show, so to speak. So instead of waiting around, I took things into my own hands, forked out my own money, and bought the tickets to Sri Lanka and Indonesia. The rest was history. I helped out with various NGOs as a volunteer and took photos in my free time. This was a scene of destruction in Banda Aceh. At the early stages, there was a lot of media coverage. But after a few months, the sensation died, and so had photojournalists who had moved on to other assignments. I looked around me and realized that there were still many stories to be told. Stories of reconstruction, of the victims picking up the pieces stoically, which are testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Using my savings, I spent about 4 months here to document the aftermath of the disaster. I covered miles on foot and talked to many survivors who told me many incredible tales. I had seen how the world responded with so much donations, but I was shocked to hear of people living in tents, not getting enough supplies. I also discovered that one of the most neglected areas would be psychological help for these people in trauma. So I embarked on a personal project to document the psychological toll of the disaster on the victims because I had not seen much coverage of this issue. As I was roaming around the debris-filled landscape, I chanced upon a teenage girl who was so badly traumatized by the tragic loss of her entire family that she had lost touch with reality. I was worried about her safety, so I took her to an NGO. As you can see, reconstruction may take 1 or 2 years, but the psychological impact may last for years or even a lifetime. And it was through her that I realized the severity of the trauma, and I visited the only mental institution in Banda Aceh. This was another woman who had lost all 25 members of her family. She was in a totally fragile and confused state. I also learned that in this mental institution, there were only 3 psychiatrists for about 300 patients, and many of these patients were heavily sedated. Well, I tried my best to document this issue, but my photos never got published because I was still new and no editors would respond to my emails. But I never let that discourage me, and I went on to cover other issues which I believed ought to be addressed. So the idea of people being displaced due to disaster, politics, and conflict is one area of my concern, and that brought me to Lebanon. The Palestinian refugees living in Camp Shatila had to endure congested living conditions for the last 64 years. They represent one of the world's longest-standing refugees, and their status is in a state of limbo. As Lebanon is a rather small country, space allocated for these refugees was limited. Moreover, the population had ballooned since 1948. As you can see in this photo, these refugees were building upwards and not extending horizontally. And many of these buildings were actually shoddily built and are considered unsafe. In this photo, a girl was walking through a narrow alley with wires hanging dangerously low. This was a common sight in the camp. I managed to visit a few families, and in one day alone, I experienced 8 power cuts. I also tried the water in this camp. It was salty. Can you imagine that happening to you? But these refugees had to put up with many inconveniences on a daily basis for decades. Besides reviving long-standing issues which have not garnered much warranted attention, I also try to cover crisis that has been left off the radar by the main media. And that brought me to Iraq. And it was perhaps the biggest risk I had taken so far in my photojournalistic ventures. I had read that in the summer of 2010, the Iranian military had been bombing some villages along the Kandil Mountains, and the purpose was to flush out the Kurdish separatists along the Iranian and Iraqi borders. Many of these refugees ended up in camps along the Kandil Mountains, and this was not a major conflict, and so there was not much international coverage. But the fact that the bombings had been going on for a few months was disturbing enough for me to make my way there on my own, using my own funds. And of course, I went to Iraq without any insurance because no company would want to insure me. And with the help of a local guide, we got there by bus and hitchhiking. Being a foreign woman without any press card, I could not have gotten access without his help to clear the various military checkpoints. You can see the fire in the mountains. The Iranian military had just bombed the area a few hours earlier, and being the only travelers on the road that night, they could easily spot our car lights, and they could fly back anytime. At that moment, I knew I had 2 choices: to take the risk and go forward, or to backtrack. I did not even think twice. I had come all the way from Singapore for this, and there was no way I was going to turn back. We finally got to the refugee camps. These people were alarmed after the bombings a few hours earlier, but luckily their campsite was spared from being hit. These are 2 Kurdish girls. One of them was injured while trying to escape from the bombings of a camp, a village. And that night, I slept in some locals' home. The next morning, I headed back to the refugee camp again. And these people told me that their supplies were limited. But their biggest fear is the big question mark hanging over their future. How long will they live like this? They had lost their homes, their land, and their livestock. How can they rebuild their lives again? And as you can see, the young and the old were affected. War does not discriminate. And so, these are the 3 places I have been to as part of my long-term project to shed light on the plight of refugees around the world. Some of the refugees I've spoken to told me that they were born in the camps and had known no other life. I hope that my photos could play a part in giving them a real hope one day. I have worked with children before, and so issues concerning children are always close to my heart. And I did my first photo essay in Cambodia back in 2005. In the midst of a booming tourism in Siem Reap, I was appalled that some people would close a blind eye to the very social issues that were still plaguing Cambodian society. In this photo, there's a community of homeless people who sleep in hammocks by the Siem Reap River. It was ironical that this woman here was breastfeeding a child, while a boy next to her was sleeping blue. I was upset when some people who ignore these kids as if they were human garbage. And that compelled me to document their lives for one intensive week in the hope of highlighting their situation. This boy had just passed out from sniffing glue. Through my interaction with the kids, I discovered that they sniff glue to forget their hunger and to escape from the painful realities of life. As many of these kids were orphans, they were homeless, and they would sleep wherever they would not be chased away. Every morning, when I set out to find them, it was difficult because they would end up sleeping in different places. I found this 11-year-old boy sleeping in a box. Knowing that they're highly vulnerable to child trafficking syndicates, I took some of them to a shelter, but they did not like it inside and preferred life on the streets. As I was working alone, I was so immersed in documenting their lives that I had overlooked my own personal safety. In this dark and secluded area, I met other glue sniffers who were much older. And I was nearly attacked by one guy, a guest who came to rescue me. It was this 14-year-old boy whom I had met earlier that day. He was so high on glue in this picture. Despite how scrawny and how damaged he seemed, I was amazed that there was still a sense of humanity in him. We both ran away from the bigger guys as I knew we were outnumbered. When I left Siem Reap, I thought about this kid sometimes, and I returned again 4 months later, but could only find one. And in November 2011, I went back again for the Angkor Photo Festival to see my works. There was almost no trace of beggars or glue sniffers on the streets. This place has changed so much over the last 6 years. I really wonder where these kids are, but I hope they are well and in a much better place now. Another one of my long-term projects concerning children is on child labor. It was in Cambodia that I witnessed many young children working. And it sometimes breaks my heart to see toddlers working the moment they are able to walk. And in this photo, I was supposedly the first photographer to gain access to a village next to a quarry. I was shocked to see little babies like this, walking barefooted, working in such conditions. Can you spot a child in this photo? This was taken at the Stormincher dump site outside Phnom Penh. I found out that some of these kids, while rummaging through the trash, had been buried alive, and some had even been run over by rubbish trucks. I learned a lot from these children, that they do not have much, but they have so much humility and dignity in them. I was especially humbled by how much tenacity they show, despite the difficult living conditions. And so, after going through some significant parts of my journey as a photojournalist, I can, with much conviction, say that I will do this for life simply because I strongly believe in the power of images to create awareness on various pertinent humanitarian issues. I also believe that images can sometimes enhance cross-cultural understanding and tear down some of the walls of prejudices and preconceived ideas that we might possess. My repertoire of work has been extended to cover various social, cultural, and political issues. And so Iran came into the picture. I've always been very intrigued by this reclusive nation, and I wanted to discover what's behind the veil. Here are some excerpts of images of women and the multifaceted roles they play in Iran. This was what I imagined Iran to be before I set foot there in 2006. Dressed exactly like them, I took a frontal shot of these women deep in prayer. But there's definitely so much more to Iran. I met people who surprised me. Young women too can be feisty and daring. Beneath the veil, they are actually not much different from you and I. We are all human beings trying to live our lives the way we want it. And that not all women in Iran wear the all-encompassing black chador, but certain nomadic tribes wear very colorful costumes. Here are some Kashgari nomads making yogurt the traditional way in the mountains. Iran has left a lasting impression on me. It has a rich and fascinating culture, and the people are also one of the most hospitable I've ever met. And so, you see, after going through my photographic journey, I can safely conclude that there is indeed method in my madness. Though I have to admit that being crazy does play a part. I hardly earn much.
Times are very tough. I
hardly earn much from getting published, so money is clearly not a motivating factor. Well, you must be wondering how I have been funding my trips. No, I am not rich, and I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I am actually a school teacher still, and I work on my photo projects during my school holidays. I have one very important point to make today. Just because I'm standing here in front of all of you does not make me any special, and it does not mean that my photos are amazing. Because I am so privileged to be standing here to be giving this talk, I am most obliged to give a voice to all the self-funded photojournalists out there whose works I admire so much, and whose works had inspired me to become who I am today. History has proven that some images had been powerful enough to influence policymakers, and this fact is instrumental in giving me the impetus to go out there to accomplish all this. I intend to devote my life to creating compelling images that will hopefully become catalysts to promote positive changes. Finally, I also want to give tribute to all the photojournalists and journalists out there who had died in the field, including the local civilians who had, in one way, helped in one way or another, or sacrificed in their lives. even though we have never met. You have not died in vain. You are the shining beacons for journalism, and your courage and dedication will always keep that fire burning in me